If the era of globalisation is definitively over, then what comes next? This is one of the biggest and most tricky questions that policymakers and thinkers grapple with at the moment. The signs that the old global order is being dismantled are impossible to ignore. Just look at Donald Trump's assault on the global trading system, the widespread use of sanctions and tariffs as tools of economic coercion. Look at China applying a chokehold to exports of key materials like rare earths, or the increasing willingness of governments of any colour around the world to intervene in financial markets or business strategies. The harder bit is describing the world that is emerging. Is this a temporary backlash, or is it a definitive break in the direction of the world economy similar to 1945 or 1989 or 2008? If the latter, then how should we think about the system that is emerging? That is the big question we're going to tackle on The Big View this week. It's what we do at Reuters Breaking Views. We tap our best sources around the world for fresh insight into the biggest issues in business, economics, and finance. I'm your host, Peter Thal Larsen. To discuss all this, I'm delighted to be joined by Branko Milanovic. Branko is a research professor at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He's devoted much of his academic career to studying the distribution of income, not just inside countries, but between countries. Almost a decade ago, he published an influential book, Global Inequality, which offered a new account of how the rise of China had helped reduce inequality between countries, but widened inequality inside countries like the United States. The resulting chart, which became known as the elephant curve for its distinctive shape, offered an explanation for the rising unhappiness among voters in the developed world, which contributed to the election of Donald Trump and the Brexit referendum in the United Kingdom. Branko's latest book is called The Great Global Transformation: National Market Liberalism in a Multipolar World. And I'm delighted he is joining us here in the studio in London's Canary Wharf. Branko Milanovic, welcome to The Big View.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. It's really a pleasure to be here.
So there's a lot to talk about your new book, but I just wanted to start just by taking a step back. I mean, it's almost a decade ago that you published the famous book, the book about inequality, global inequality, which obviously was very timely in terms of what was happening politically in the world at that point, and prompted a lot of debate about the argument, some debate about the data that you used. I wonder, sort of looking back on it now, how's your thinking on that topic evolved over given what's happened since?
Well, it's a good question. My thinking on the interpretation of the facts has not changed very much. What has happened is that even the evolution of global inequality, the decrease of global inequality, has continued because China has continued outperforming the Western countries, or actually not only China, India as well, with the exception of 1 year in COVID. So it has not really changed. If I were to rewrite the book, I think there will be just an extension on what I did. What has changed is that my interest has now become, and that's actually, I think, quite obvious even in capitalism alone, has become broader. In other words, I believe now we should try to situate inequality in general and global inequality and individual country inequalities within a more political framework. So this book, the Great Global Transformation, has a certain political side, as did capitalism alone, and that side was really absent in global inequality.
So I see. So you have to look at the economics and the politics all joined up.
I think you have to look in economics and politics. And I was recently, when I was writing something else, I was somewhat critical of people who just look at numbers and economics, because inequality is essentially a social phenomenon. It's very hard to say that inequality can be studied only as an economic phenomenon without at all taking into account politics. It's rather obvious. Tax rates are determined by politicians. Subsidies are by politicians. Social transfers, pensions, it's all political. And then globally, it's determined by the relations between different countries. So really leaving politics out seems to me sort of unjustified.
Yeah, I think that's right, and also just the perception of inequality is also kind of important in the political debates. I mean, you obviously pointed out that the rise of China and that the global inequality had decreased, but obviously that at the same time inequality within, particularly in the developed world,
Right.
inequality had increased, and it seems like there's something there about not just about the absolute levels of income or levels of equality, but also relative how people were doing relative to each other, which then shapes the politics.
Absolutely. Let me give you, for example, an example that actually I use in the book, and to some extent it motivates the book. I'll put it in very simple-minded terms. Obviously, there are caveats to that, but let's look at it very simple-mindedly. Let's look only at China. There is a rise of China and rise of Asia. Now, it does provoke at one level the rise of China, which is a desirable thing in itself, provokes a geopolitical conflict with the United States simply because China is so big. Once China becomes the largest economy in the world, and today it is in PPP terms, or the second largest in market exchange rates, it obviously leads to other geopolitical implications. Okay, so we know that. But what also happens with the rise of China, and as we know, globalization, outsourcing, use of foreign labor, and so on, it creates a sort of domestic problem in terms of income distribution in rich countries. In other words, leaving aside the details, but either with the middle class or lower middle class or other people are not happy. So the interesting part here is that you have an external event, which is the rise of China, having a deeply political internal result. And I think that's why I think there is this interconnection, whatever, or interrelationship between global developments, political developments, and local or national economic developments.
But how real do you think those are? I mean, obviously they're real in absolute terms, but in terms of the way people perceive them. I mean, does the average person in the US, how aware are they of the fact that they're now less well off compared to the median Chinese person than they were before? It seems like those two worlds don't necessarily overlap.
No, but I think actually where people do notice it, they do notice it in the sort of dissatisfaction with their income growth, which then they attribute to US jobs or the English jobs going out to somewhere else. So it could be Eastern Europe in the case of Germany, for example, or it could be China in the case of the US, or it could be somewhere else in Africa in case of France. So they attribute that. Now, the fact that I'll take Italians here because really Italy is very interesting since it has not grown in 25 years. You see the lower part of the Italian income distribution really declining very much in global ranking. Now, your question is absolutely right. Like, how would an Italian notice that somebody from let's suppose Thailand has overtaken him? He will not, but he would gradually see his lesser ability to purchase international goods. You would not be going for a month vacation to Thailand. You will not be going to the next FIFA World Cup. And I think the message of this ranking would eventually transpire to you.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. So this book is called The Great Global Transformation, which was a clear reference to the Carl Polanyi's famous The Great Transformation, which was about the rise of the market economy in England and the social and political upheaval that came with that. I mean, why invite that comparison, I wonder?
Well, it's tricky, obviously. But I do think that we are talking about the great transformation in this case. It's a global transformation in the sense that at the same time, you have big changes which have taken place in Asia, particularly, and also in the United States and indirectly in Europe. When I say indirectly, because I don't think that Europe was as an important player as these two other large players, and India also. But Europe was, in a sense, passive in that relationship. However, the European position was affected but it was affected by the rise of China. And so I think, I think that it is legitimate to talk about great global transformation. Now, the fact that, of course, the book actually takes the title, with the exception of one word, from Polanyi, well, maybe it just helps people remember the book, but it does also, of course, Polanyi, when he spoke of transformation, had also in mind a big transformation. There is no doubt about that. So this is another big, but it's a little bit different.
Well, and I think you make the point quite well that just how seismic the rise of China is in the context of the world economy, going from 2% of world output to 22% on purchasing power parity basis. I mean, it's unlike anything we've ever seen, or probably will ever see again, I would imagine.
Yeah, I think something that was unlike that there is no doubt, actually. And I do a small calculation where I say, okay, let's suppose that you have some unit of util, something, and then you say, okay, how many utils have been created when you have 40 years of uninterrupted growth at approximately 8% per year for approximately 1.1 billion people. That was the approximate number of the Chinese over that period. And you calculate that number, and it's number X. And then you say, okay, how about Japan? Japan had also about 35 years of growth. But the problem is that Japan is 100 million people. So you really have an entirely different order of magnitude in case of China.
And Japan did not grow at 8%.
It didn't grow, but it during the best period, it actually grew, I think, about 7%. So it was close. But the simple difference it lasted longer in the case of China uninterruptedly, and then the number of people was 14 times or whatever, 10 or 11 times larger. So that makes a difference.
Yeah. So if I forgive me if I'm correct, if I'm summarizing this incorrectly, but it seems to me that the sort of the somewhat provocative thesis of the book is that Donald Trump in the US and Xi Jinping in China and Vladimir Putin in Russia are all part of a sort of backlash against the era of globalization, a reassertion of sort of national power, and against the sort of the elites who emerged from that period of globalization as well. Can you just expand on that a bit? How you connect those three?
Yeah, I'm sure that's actually probably the most contentious, possibly, part of the book. I just left it for the end, and to be quite honest, I think the book is empirical, analytical, and this political part is an important part, but I don't think that actually the value of the book should be just basically hang on that part. Now, my argument is the following. The neoliberal globalization, I think, basically lasted from probably end of the Berlin and the communism, or approximately late 1980s, early 1990s. Might have been around 2000, 2001 with Chinese accession to WTO. But from 2008, we do have a certain sort of readjustment. And certainly with Trump's first election, we do have a significant readjustment with respect to China. Now, the three individuals that you mentioned, Trump, Xi Jinping, and Putin, to some extent, I see them as what I call counter-revolutionaries. I'm not using this term in a sort of normative sense. I'm just using reacting against what you might call the high globalization. And to be very short, Trump is really, in my opinion, and people who support him, react against those who benefited quite a lot in the United States and about the ideological monopoly or hegemony of these elites. Xi Jinping very clearly is reacting against the policies which allowed very rich people to join and have a say in Communist Party and the state. So he wants to have a state autonomous from the rich people, essentially. So there is another reaction. And I think Putin too reacted against the Yeltsin's oligarchy and actually brought to power intelligence services. So in that sense, I see all three of them being counter-revolutionaries in that sense. Again, I'm not using the term in a positive or negative, simply reacting against globalization.
They're reacting to the system that came before. I mean, there's a lot to discuss.
Yes.
But maybe just to start with the US, I mean, just thinking about Donald Trump, I mean, it's definitely true that sort of Trump has support from people who are definitely sort of unhappy with globalization and with the kind of the consequences of it in terms of loss of jobs, loss of manufacturing, and are trying to reverse some of that. Also anti-immigration, but you could also say that the sort of the technology elites, the tech billionaires, and the kind of the people on Wall Street who did very well out of this system are also they seem to be supporting Donald Trump, and they seem to be doing quite well out of it at the moment, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the stock market is booming. At least it was until a few days ago. They're getting tax breaks. It's not obvious that they're suffering under this sort of this counter-revolution, as you call it.
No, they are not. Actually, my point there is what I introduced, actually, it's in the title of the book. It's called National Market Liberalism. And to make it very simple, I want to say that the liberalism as such has both international and domestic component. The international component is, which we know, that free circulation of labor, capital, goods, services, low tariff rates, flexible exchange rate, and all that. Domestically, it has really a neoliberal part that you mentioned, which in my opinion has been now even sort of pushed forward in the deregulation, lower taxation, actually subsidies to the rich people, for example, and all of that. And that, I think, actually what has happened is we have a combination between a sort of deeper neoliberalism domestically, that's why I call it national market liberalism,
I see,
and rejection of the international component, which is basically now replaced with some kind of pseudo or quasi or maybe real mercantilist policies. So the fact that the rich people are doing well and actually supporting Trump does not really surprise me. And just to go back to Polanyi, the argument in Polanyi was always that it is the state that creates a free market. In other words, they are creating the free market because it is good for them to have less regulation. It's good to them to have less taxation on capital. It's good to have low tax on inheritance. So they like that. So I don't see the necessarily contradiction between some rich people supporting him at the same time that people who are losers, quote unquote, from globalization support him as well.
I see. Okay, that makes sense. I mean, it's still. It's a little bit of a stretch to apply the word liberalism to all these things, but I understand. I think the point you're making. What about then? I mean, there is still a sort of dependence, particularly for you think about the technology industry, or you think about the big US financial firms and stuff. They are still their interest is still in having access to a global system, right? In being able to trade, being able to sell their semiconductors or their cloud services or whatever it is around the world. So there is a tension there. I mean, I just wonder how you think that resolves itself.
No, there is. I mean, surely there is a tension, but I do think that if you look at the situation today and compare it with 20 years ago, I think we do have to, or even 10 years ago, we have to recognize that we have entered a different world. So we have now, even this idea of friendshoring, or actually looking at the political implications of outsourcing or supply chains. That really didn't play a role 10 years ago. But nowadays it does play a role. Now we have not had a sharp cut that essentially there was huge globalization and then bang, it ended. We don't have that. And even if you look at the trade as a share of GDP, it has not actually declined. So we are having continued globalization, but under, I think, different conditions. And I think psychologically under sort of rather skeptical and, how should I say it, more careful eye or look at it.
Yeah, I think that's definitely fair. But do you think? I mean, there is an argument that says actually that this is really about the US, which is sort of withdrawing from the international order, and actually, particularly look at trade. The rest of the world at the moment, and we'll see how long that lasts with Chinese exports and stuff. But the rest of the world seems to be sort of carrying on as before. I mean, do we necessarily need to think about this as a complete breaking apart of the system, or is it really a U.S. story?
Well, it's a very good question, actually. Of course, U.S. story can never be a U.S. story because U.S. is too big, so it becomes a global story. But I do agree with you that, of course, the rest of the system, you can say, actually, it's continued more or less as it was. However, even if you look at Europe, it's not exactly. First, you take the relationship with Russia. That's a significant change. I mean, lack of imports, sort of seizure of assets and all of that. That also falls under the category of deglobalization. It falls under the category of coercion. Actually, coercive use of trade or financial assets. So it cannot be really sort of taken out. Secondly, European relations with China have also become a little bit rockier than they used to be. So things have changed. And then if you look at immigration as well, European immigration policies have become tougher than they used to be again. So I would say on all three counts, there is a retrenchment. If you were to define globalization, we're really almost full freedom and of movement, as I said before, of factors of production, including labor, not full movement, but significant movement, you would really see the retrenchment, I think, even in the case of Europe.
It's happening already.
Yeah.
So just to turn to China then, obviously there's been a big shift. I mean, the arrival of Xi Jinping was a big shift in terms of the way China was organized, and the fact that he's obviously stayed longer than he was initially intended to. But it's probably less of a sort of rupture than say Donald Trump getting elected in the US is. Is China better suited for this kind of world? Do you think? Is it better set up?
Well, China, I think, has played its cards quite well, it seems to me, until now. And even in first, not overreacting to Trump, and secondly, by sort of mirroring what Trump did. And it seems recently, actually, according to some reviews in the papers, like even sort of, how should I say, playing back, giving back as much as getting. In other words, sort of reacting even more than Trump was expecting. So probably feeling that their position is stronger than it was. But, going back to what you asked me before about this counter-revolutionaries and entrenchment, it's interesting when you look at when did it start. And if we look at that, we see, for example, Putin starting against 2008. That was the famous speech. 2007, 2008 was invasion of Georgia, the two republics there. Then 2012 was the election of Xi Jinping, and that was already then realized as a change. And 2016 was the election of Trump. And as you know, the policies that Trump started then basically continued under Biden and then continued now. So we are basically having in the US maybe now almost 10 years of such policies.
Is there? How do you sort of think about the possibility of a backlash against the backlash, if you like? I mean, there are a lot of people who benefited from this system, right? And they have access to material goods that they wouldn't have had otherwise. They get to travel and move around. There's quite a lot of people who have quite a lot to lose from the world going in this direction.
True. Well, it is possible, but if I look at the forces that are, as I was saying before, that are being harnessed by the counter-revolutionaries, or rather that the counter-revolutionaries are riding, these forces are pretty big. I mentioned them before. I don't need to re-mention them. However, if one were to actually take an entirely different point of view, yes, we don't know what the future holds. We can imagine the following scenario. We can imagine a scenario when Xi Jinping is replaced by somebody who is like Hu Jintao, or actually much more even progressive and pro-globalization and pro-good relations with the US, or somebody like that. We can imagine that Putin is overthrown and Russia goes back. Hard to imagine, but you can imagine many things. Go back to the Yeltsin type of policies. I said very hard, but. And third, you can imagine that Trump loses the election and is being replaced by somebody like Mamdani, I suppose. But
I can't imagine that.
That's very hard. but I think that when you put these three things, well, what is the likelihood of all three happening? And it seems to me low. And I can imagine one of them. I will not tell you which one, but I can imagine one. But imagining three, it's very hard. And imagining also Europe going to the situation which was before the Soviet war, the Russian war in Ukraine, is also difficult to imagine.
Yeah, no, it does seem quite significant. What about just returning to the inequality question? So how does this then, this world as you've described it, how does that then translate into those income numbers and the distribution of income? How do you see that playing out?
That's also very interesting, because what has now happened, and I think it's really very important development when it comes to global inequality, China is no longer a sort of automatic global inequality reducer. In other words, the growth of China, which we have taken as a given for 30 years, China grows. Obviously, it reduces global poverty because fewer people in China remain poor, but it also reduces global inequality. Well, that's no longer the case. China has now kind of, to illustrate that, the person with the median income in China has now overtaken the global median. So essentially, Chinese growth, let's suppose everything else is given and China grows at 6%. In the past, that would mean, okay, China is reducing global inequality. Now it means China is adding, not hugely, but it's adding to global inequality because it becomes more distant from large African countries, like, for example, Sudan, Congo, Ethiopia, Nigeria, and so forth, and also from Bangladesh and even India. So the engine, if we really have to think of the 21st century, do we want really global inequality to go down? We really have to think of large African countries and India and Bangladesh. And Pakistan. That's where I think the action is. So we really have to forget China as such now. I mean, for that particular purpose. Obviously, we don't forget China for other purposes, but for this one.
For that purpose.
Yeah.
What about the inequality within the developed world, particularly the US? I mean, obviously, you could, a stated goal of Trump's, you could argue, is to at least improve the lot of the sort of the average American working man. I think he's mostly talking about men.
Okay, man,
does that happen in this situation?
I'm skeptical of that. I think actually U.S. inequality would probably go up under Trump. But let me also mention that U.S. inequality, despite what people say, but U.S. inequality in the last 10 years has been on a plateau. We are having years when it went up a little bit higher, years when it went down. Actually, the most significant decline, I'm surprised that people don't speak of that more, but that was the 2020, the year of the COVID, because of the large government transfer system, the CARES Act, which basically we're talking about 15 or 70% of GDP that has been sort of given away. And when you look at the survey data, what you do note is that up to the 70th percentile of the U.S. income distribution, people have received money from the government. And that has really reduced a Gini coefficient, a measure of inequality, quite significantly. Then, of course, 2021, we go back more or less to the same situation as 2019, 2022, the same. But we have not had over the last 10 or 12 years incessant or unstoppable increase of inequality in the US. We have had a plateau, high plateau, but a plateau. What will happen with Trump? I would not be surprised that it went up, but one should put it in that context. We are not having like increases permanently every year.
I have to ask you, I'm actually amazed that this hasn't come up yet, because every conversation these days, AI comes up immediately. And we've been talking for half an hour without mentioning AI. But thinking, not asking you to comment on the technology, but just the possible economic consequences of that. I mean, the general assumption seems to be that would be bad for inequality. It will lead to more inequality. Do you sort of see that happening?
Yes, I do. But Peter, you didn't realize that all my answers were actually ChatGPT?
Okay, I see.
You see now it's actually
you've just got something whispering in your ear.
I do actually. I don't have any original views on that. The least original view is the one that I have, which says, okay, what does it mean? It means, like in the past, that there will be some machines, which we now call artificial intelligence, that are going to replace human labor. Technically speaking, it's the same thing like you have spinning jenny replacing human labor, but that human labor was less skilled and this human labor is more skilled. But in essence, it's replacement of human labor by some produced instrument. And that would imply that actually you would have increased capital share because that instrument would be owned and produced by people who have shares there and who will be paid. So that's, I think, it's not very original view. It actually says, okay, we will have increased capital share. Capital share is very heavily concentrated. Consequently, we should have an increase in inequality. I think it's quite possible, but of course we then have to look who is going to be replaced, which type of labor, what it will happen, and will it create new jobs? As of course we have seen, the internet has created new jobs. So it's not, I think we should not suffer, as we often do, from this, what is this called, the belief that there is a given quantity of labor.
The lump of labor fallacy.
The lump of labor fallacy, exactly. So if there is a lump of labor fallacy, so basically we lose 15,000 jobs, they are gone forever, there will be new jobs. I don't want to be unrealistically optimistic, but there are always new jobs. Now, whether they would fully compensate the old jobs, that's a different question.
Yeah. By the way, it's very refreshing to hear someone say they don't have an original view on AI, because I think more people should say that actually. But anyway, thank you for that. One final thing, just to wrap up. I mean, I guess implicit in all of this, and you address some of this in the book as well, is this possibility of conflict, right? That this system leads to kind of Cold War or hot war or something like that. Obviously, the idea that countries that are well off don't go to war with each other has been debunked many times. How do you sort of, particularly in relation between the US and China, which seems to be the main confrontation, what would be your expectation there?
No, I have to say that I'm very, how should I say, fearful of conflict. I think we have started really taking, after the end of the Cold War, we have sort of forgotten the possibility of a hot war. And a hot war between great powers. Because if you look at the current constellation, it does remind you of the pre-1914 constellation. It is, several large powers, now, of course, at the global scale, essentially fighting each other at first for domination in different parts of the world, for the control of the minerals, for the control of people, of countries, and all of that. And that kind of incipient conflict, I think, has a tendency, as we have seen in 1914, that one trigger that we can never actually say where it would be. Nowadays, we talk about Taiwan. We talked about, of course, Ukraine and Russia. Well, the new trigger could be Venezuela. You cannot really, under such conditions of potential conflict, the trigger could be totally at a place that you can never imagine. And then something happens, one power reacts, the other power counter-reacts, and as we know, then of course all the bets are off after a bit.
Yeah, and then inequality becomes the least of our problems.
Well, yes, war certainly would make inequality seem like not a big problem.
Yeah. Well, on that slightly less optimistic note, we have to leave it there. But Branko, thank you very much. This has been really fascinating. Covered a lot of ground. We could talk for much longer. But thank you very much for coming into the studio.
Thank you very much. It was really a pleasure.
That's our show this week. Thanks to Branko for joining us in the studio. As always, thanks to you for tuning in. This podcast was produced by Oliver Taslich in London. You can listen to a new episode of The Big View every Tuesday. Check out our sister show, Viewsroom, every Thursday, as well as the other great podcasts from the Reuters team. To get in touch with feedback, questions, and ideas, please email us on breakingviews-podcasts@tr.com. That's breakingviews-podcasts@tr.com. If you like what you heard, please rate the show and leave us a review. And check out our views on the biggest stories in business and finance every day at breakingviews.com and reuters.com.